Thank you very much, Chairwoman. I appreciate your leadership of this subcommittee and appreciate the chance to speak with you, Mr. Dodaro. I want to thank you and the GAO for the extensive work that you do in, if you will, accounting for what's happening in our government. Those things that are measured are those things you can control. If they're not measured, you can't control them. And I appreciate the work that you're doing, particularly that identifies waste and duplication in government, of which there is plenty. This annual duplication report, I understand, was first created as part of a debt ceiling deal. It's become essential reading, and I appreciate what you've uncovered and the improvements you brought to government already. I think, like many that serve with me, we're discouraged by the high levels of waste and fraud and abuse that were associated with our COVID relief efforts. I understand by some reports in the media, as much as $400 billion may have been wasted. I hope that's not accurate, but obviously great concern. Back in March, I led a letter with some 30 of my colleagues to President Biden requesting more information on this extraordinary waste of taxpayer funds. I'm also interested in discussing how the government could be fumbling taxpayer money in other ways, like through federal work-at-home policies, and wonder to what extent we're less effective, less efficient by virtue of allowing those to continue. I'm also curious about the duplicative lines of effort that go on in government, particularly as they relate to one area in particular, disaster prevention and mitigation. I've worked with a number of folks to help put in place a wildland fire mitigation and management commission. We've seen great success from that group so far, and hopefully we'll be able to do a better job in fighting wildfires in the American West and apparently in Eastern Canada as well. So we obviously rely on you to help us spend our money more wisely. I look forward to hearing your report today, and thank you and your entire team for the dedicated service you provide for our country. Thank you. I thought that I had, an eye-popping statistic when some years ago I noted that there were some 49 different federal job training programs and thought the duplication was outrageous. But you've blown that away with, what did you say, about 140 different broadband expansion programs. And I'm trying to understand why that happens. I presume part of it is that all of us who want to get elected, and that's the people up here, want to show that we're doing something about something our voters care about. So we fashion a bill, we get it passed. We don't really spend a lot of time asking whether there's already something that deals with that. We get that passed, and the executive branch dutifully sets up an agency or department or whatever to take it on. And there's never a cleaning up. And I don't know what potential there is for actually cleaning it up. I mean, these 140 out there, whatever the number was it 140? Was that the number?
It was over 130.
Over 130, okay.
That's close enough.
Close to 140, yeah. Right.
Yeah, right.
So what's the process? Because to say, well, Congress should deal with it, the challenge we have, of course, is that we don't have a person in charge of Congress. That the White House has a president and then a chief of staff and so forth, so they're more like a corporation that can carry out action. Congress is, just in the Senate side, 100 people all pulling in different directions or in the same direction, but all pulling. How do we actually consolidate and eliminate and put together efforts so that it's easier for us to be able to address the issue that we're talking about without having tons of people and departments and wheels spinning and money being wasted? How do you get from here to there? Do you have a sense of when has that worked? When have we been able to consolidate?
Yeah. Well, this happened in the STEM area, science, technology, engineering, and math. We had over 160 some programs in that area. We were able to work with Congress to reduce it by having the White House and others have a strategy to look at the programs and make proposals to the Congress. And we're suggesting in the broadband area that the administration come up with a national strategy. I mean, what's the plan here? You have a number of these programs to build infrastructure, a number of them to provide devices to people, another one to help them, set of them programs, afford to be able to purchase the broadband authority. None of them are really coordinated over a period of time. Some of them have different speeds associated with it. And this is an issue that's not going to be static, that if we do it one time, you're going to have it all fixed. There's about 13% of the population right now, about 42 million people, that don't have any access. And everybody's always trying to chase that. But then there's the question of once you have 4G, now you need 5G, now you need, and that's going to continue in that path. So we need a strategy to say, what are our goals? How are we going to measure? You don't really have that now and as a national level. And we're committing $65 billion through the Infrastructure Investment Act on top of about 40-some billion dollars that's already been spent. And if you date back to the Recovery Act days in 2009, we were spending money then on broadband authority. So it's going to be an endless federal investment. And who would make an investment long-term over time without a strategy and a way to check the strategy? So that's what we're calling for in this case. And I think, Congress can require the administration to do it. They've kind of balked. They're still mulling it over. They didn't agree or disagree to do it. But I think Congress can require them to do it, and then you can have a debate on something right now rather than just all these individual programs going forward.
It sounds like it's something that has to be executed by the executive branch.
Right.
If they're not moving on that front, you're looking to Congress to insist that they do move on that front.
Absolutely.
I must admit, I'm a little frustrated sometimes. We'll call for the administration to do something, the executive branch to do something, and we ask them to do so much stuff that it just doesn't happen. This might be a big enough topic, particularly with $60 billion in infrastructure bill, that might motivate an effort to really make sure that we develop a strategy.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think they're on the precipice of potentially agreeing, but it's not an easy thing to do. But there's also potentially some statutory limitations to coordinating the programs. And so you need somebody to be able to advise and say, well, here's our strategy, here's what we need to implement it, but we need some changes, legislative changes, in order to make it more efficient and effective to be able to coordinate, over time. But I think it's a big enough investment, and it's not going to go away. I mean, it's not going to go away. If this was a one-time thing, I'd say, well, the money's gone, and you're going to get what you're going to get. But in this case, I don't think this is the last investment we're going to make in this area.
The vulnerability of our various governmental systems for fraud is substantial, obviously. But my impression is that relative to the private sector, the fraud that is perpetrated against the government is much greater. And I don't know why that is precisely, but my expectation is it's going to get a lot worse with AI. Yes. That the capacity of bad actors to hack into our systems will be greater. I certainly don't want to reveal private information, but I was approached by a colleague, not a government colleague, whose Social Security number was stolen, address and name was taken, and this person who stole that information filled out a 2-page tax form, sent it in, and received almost $1 million in a tax refund. Totally fraudulent.
Right.
That's almost never going to happen in the private sector. American Express is not going to send you $1 million. I mean, it's just, right. I don't understand how this can go on and how bad our systems are. And given the advent of AI, is it going to get a lot worse? And do we need to dramatically up our game to prevent fraud?
Absolutely, absolutely. The fraud that occurred during the pandemic programs was epic in my experience. I've been in GAO in 2 weeks. I've been in GAO 50 years. I've never seen it as bad. Now, we're throwing a lot of money at the issue, but we harmed ourselves by allowing self-certification in the beginning. In the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, so unemployment insurance forms. And I think it was well-intended. We were trying to get the money out. But, these type of emergencies, the best in human nature comes out and the worst in human nature comes out. In this case, you had organized fraud. It wasn't just national, it was international. We've estimated that at a minimum, the unemployment insurance fraud's $60 billion. We're making a higher estimate now. And then we're going to do a government-wide estimate by the end of the year on fraud across the federal government. We worked with the Congress back in 2015 and 16 to pass the Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act, which has, again, best practices for preventing fraud. Too many people in the federal government, program managers, think it's the responsibilities of the inspector generals or GAO to combat fraud. It's their responsibility to prevent it in the first place. And they need more guidance and assistance to do this. If that act had been implemented properly, SBA and Labor Department would have been much better prepared to deal with the fraud issues during the pandemic. So that's still on the to-do list, is to get the agencies up to be better prepared on fraud. We need better identity verification approaches, more careful approaches. We need better data sharing. Now, part of the problem in the government is that there's a tension between sharing of information to catch the fraudsters and the protection of privacy on a number of people, a number of programs, and not wanting to share the information under the guise of privacy. And there are legitimate privacy issues, but they could be dealt with. On the IRS identity theft fraud, we suggested to the Congress years ago that they expedite the W-2 data coming from employers. Employers previously they had to give it to the employees by January, all right? And then they didn't have to give it to the government until April. So the government didn't have the form to compare against the submission of the information return. So we got Congress to change that. That's helped a lot, but there's still some gaps in that area. And we used to have some open recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you. Are penalties too small for defrauding the government? I must admit, when I heard some of the stories on the PPP program and the entities, law firms, and others that were taking this money, and I understand you might have thought that your business was going to be affected, but if it's not affected, and it was not affected, you got to return the money. If you don't, it didn't seem like the penalties were substantial, and I wonder, should we substantially increase the penalties for defrauding the government of the United States, such that people really think twice about doing what so many do? Now, I recognize a lot of it is organized crime. They don't care what the penalties are because they're hard to find and hard to convict, but and particularly if they're outside the country. But are we not showing tough enough penalty?
Yeah, the people who are being convicted are getting substantial jail time. I mean, I'll provide the details for the record. But I'd like to think about the penalty issue and come back to you with a more thoughtful answer, and I give you off the top of my head. But the one thing I would suggest is in the PPP program, Congress extended the time frame for, what's the term's eluding me, the statute of limitations. Thank you. To 10 years from 5 years. And the administration and the inspector generals have recommended the same thing be done for the Labor Department and the unemployment insurance program. So I would encourage Congress to extend the statute of limitations for those things. I'll look at the penalties issues and see, if we have any recommendations in that area. But the one thing is, you're not going to get a lot of this money back, but you can enforce the law and make people pay the penalties for defrauding the government. Unless you do that, you're exactly right. If the consequences aren't there, that's and it's easy.
Yeah.
It's too easy.
Yeah, too easy. Going back to AI for a moment, do we? And is this something that you would do? Do we need to upgrade our capacity to defend against fraud in a much more substantial way as a result of the advent of AI? And are you recommending that? Are you talking to various agencies saying, okay, look, you guys got to dramatically increase the kind of protective measures that are employed, or the consequences could be quite substantial?
Yeah, we definitely need to upgrade as a government in order to prepare for artificial intelligence and then ultimately quantum computing. As well. We haven't done as much detail as your question implies. We have come up with a framework for how to audit artificial intelligence algorithms to make sure that they're done properly as well. So we'll take more of a look at that issue, Senator, going forward on that issue. Because we're looking at a lot of artificial intelligence, for example, in the Defense Department, where we haven't looked at it specifically as it relates to the fraud area, but we should.
Yeah. One concern of substance is the fact that you come out with recommendations every year, that you lay out things that you like to have, think we ought to do to become more effective. Many of those things are implemented, but many are not. How do we prioritize your recommendations, and do you do that, and do you publicize that? Meaning, do you have a top 10 list, all right? Congress, these are the top 10 things, or, you know, President Biden, these are the top 10 things you really ought to focus on. I somehow, I mean, I appreciate the report, but I think it's got to be far more in the public mind than it is. And we tend to respond to what things the public is talking about and concerned about, and what things are on the news, whether it's cable or broadcast or social media. Do you need to increase your publicity capacity to get the message out there and to create the fire that's needed to actually create some of the improve some of the challenges we have and fulfill the recommendations that you make?
Yeah, every year I send a letter to the head of every major department and agency in the federal government saying, these are how many open recommendations still exist for your department, and here's my priority list, our priority list of GAO of the top, you know. Some agencies it's 5, some it's 12, some DOD is 90, but they're a big agency. And that's made public. It's on our website. So we send it to all the congressional committees. We're also working on one report with all our open recommendations for the Congress, all matters of congressional consideration. And I would point out, you know, each year we track how many have been implemented by the executive branch, how many by the Congress. Executive branch is ahead.
I'm not surprised.
In the game. But the big money comes from Congress's actions.
Wow.
And so we'll submit that report. Yeah. I mean, we have an appendix in this report that we're talking about today that lists all the open matters for Congress in this area that have over $1 billion in potential savings. So we prioritize by that avenue as well. Because Senator Lankford asked me this question years ago. So I call it the Lankford Appendix, but it's in there every year.
Well, let the record show that the Democrat Party's in the majority in Congress now, so they take full responsibility. Let me also just ask a question that's maybe small or more, but that is with regards to at-home employment by our federal employees. Did that result in a reduction in services and inefficiencies of a substantial amount? And if so, were you able to audit that or evaluate that? Does that continue to plague our government agencies?
It definitely caught a number of agencies off guard, because a number of them were moving in the other direction, where they weren't allowing telework, particularly during the Trump administration. And so when the pandemic hit, they weren't well prepared with technology as much as they should, or policies or whatever. It definitely had an effect where people were dealing directly with the public, you know, those agencies that do that, you know, Social Security, IRS, et cetera, because they're, you know, a lot of the technologies enabled them to do things, you know, electronically. But still, a number of people don't have access, and we talked earlier about people that don't have broadband or people that don't have devices or whatever, so they need to walk in to an office. And so we're looking now at, okay, post-pandemic, where are you? What are your plans? How it's going to affect service delivery? And we'll have a report on that going forward. We're also looking more broadly at the private sector, what the experience has been in the private sector of telework and remote work, et cetera. That report will be out soon. So we're studying the issue. It definitely had an effect. How much? But what should the posture be going forward? Because on one side, there's the customer service to the public that has to be dealt with effectively. On the other side, it's recruiting and retaining the workforce necessary to be able to deliver that service in a quality manner. And so you have to find the right kind of balance there, I think. But the balance is different depending upon the different missions that the agencies have. But we're looking at it and giving it a great deal of thought. Then there's the question also related to Chair Hassan's question about, you asked about personal property, but there's the real property aspect of the government too. And do you need all these facilities? We've said for years before the pandemic, you have more facilities than you need. You ought to get rid of them. And we haven't been doing such a good job at the government level to do it. Congress passed a law in 2016 trying to create a board, and the board would recommend properties. There's 4 rounds. So far, we've been through 3. The first round, I think we've sold 10 properties so far for $194 million. And then the proceeds were supposed to fund additional rounds. And then some of the board members quit. Some of the sales strategies changed. And so one of our recommendations is that the GSA do a lessons learned and try to figure out what went wrong, and what can be done to improve it. Now, there's one more round left in 2024. So we'll be back with an update on that area. But that's on our high-risk list because they've made some progress in getting out of costly leases, which is good. But this whole question about where the employees are going to work and how much office space they need, I think has those implications too, as well as, but the main thing has to be on effectively accomplishing your mission. That's got to be the primary goal. And the question is how best to do that and what kind of policies you need to have your employees where and doing what. And measuring on outcomes. Too much time in the government we spend looking at process kind of issues. Are they there? Or they could be in the office full time and be doing a lousy job, as opposed to being somewhere else and doing a better job. So you have to focus on what are the outcomes? Are citizens being served? Are being served well? How do they feel they're being served, et cetera, and focus on the outcomes.
The question.
I did. This is perhaps personal curiosity, but is there better technology for identifying whether someone is who they say they are? My impression is that my credit card company is pretty good at that, but the government is not terribly good. We're still using Social Security numbers. Numbers. Is there better technology? Should we move? I think again with AI and technology that misidentification of people approaching government is going to be an even greater problem. Do we need to find a better way to authenticate if it's a real human and who it is and where they live? Is there a technology, an opportunity here?
The answer is yes. We need to have better technology. Exactly what it is, I'm not prepared to say at this point. But we need to be better, not only for individuals, but also for companies. Yeah. We have the same kind of issue there. But yes, there's better ways, but we have to be willing to deal with some of the potential privacy issues associated with it. And so far, that's been a little bit of a problem. But it's the key, if we can get better technology to better verify people, it's the key to making payments quickly without sacrificing, the integrity of the programs. So if you can identify their identity early on in the problem. That's why I was saying before, you don't have self-certification. You can't have that. There was no checking done. That could have been checked easily in a lot of cases. But there's better ways to do it. And I know I've had discussions with the executive branch about that and try to move. They're supposed to be working on an executive order about how to improve verification, identity verification. Yeah. It's not forthcoming yet. So
at the airport, when I go to clear, they take a picture of my eye or my thumbprint, And yet, you know, when I apply for a refund from the IRS, I just give a social security number. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, yeah.
We
No,
have
I
to have
know.
a system that could read the,
Yeah.
yeah.
But there's just a lot, I mean, there are federal agencies using facial recognition technology, but they're facing a lot of blowback too. I mean, it's mostly in the law enforcement areas right now, but IRS tried to do it, and they got a lot of pushback on that issue. So it's always a tension there that we face as a country on